Hello and welcome. We're talking with Minette Norman, the co-author of the Psychological Safety Playbook. Today we're talking about psychological safety. We're talking about a playbook which is new and just off the presses that helps inspire leaders to lead more powerfully simply by just being human. Welcome, Minette. You're a multifaceted person. You've done so many things with your career. To use your words, it's been an unexpected career. You've been a technical writer, a business leader in Silicon Valley, a leadership consultant, a board member, an inclusion evangelist, and today we're here to talk to you about Minette, the author. Welcome.
Thank you, Peter. Thanks for having me.
Tell us, our listeners, about the journey to your psychological safety playbook. Did you always have a book in you? Why has this one come out, and why now?
Well, I guess that I always had a book in me. I always wanted to write a book. And as you mentioned, I was a technical writer early in my career, way back in the late 80s, early 90s. But I wanted to write something beyond a technical manual. So I always wanted to write a book. And the book about psychological safety was not the book that I actually expected to write. I had another book in the works, and we can talk about that later, but I'd been working on it for a few years when I met this person, Karolin Helbig, that I ended up co-writing the book with. And we met in an online class in 2021. And the book was on psychological safety assessments based on the work of Amy Edmondson. And so it's a longer story. I'm happy to tell it if you'd like, because it is kind of interesting. But I ended up just taking a little detour to write this book because I believed that psychological safety is so critical and so foundational if we are to build more inclusive cultures and workplaces.
Right. Yeah, no, fantastic. And you're preaching to the choir here. I one of the things that I wanted to just spend a little bit more time on is your relationship with Karolin. And you said you met in an online class. What made it click between the two of you, and what made writing a book together become possible?
There's a little bit of magic there that happened. And it's kind of cool because it's also a story of how you can really establish such a strong human connection with someone you've never met in the real world, only in the virtual world. So we met in this online class. There were about 25, 30 people in the class, and we were divided into smaller cohorts. And Karolin and I were in the same cohort. And we just we liked each other. We liked what the other person had to say. But then the way it all came together is I was actually on one of our fellow students' podcasts, and Karolin tuned in. And she says, I never listened to podcasts, but I kind of wanted to hear what you had to say. It was about leadership. And she realized in listening to me that we were very closely aligned in how we think about leading. She's also a leadership consultant, former McKinsey for many years. And she actually has a PhD in human genetics. So she has a very different background from mine. But she said we're very much aligned in how we think about leading teams and the work we do with our clients. And the thing she heard me say that really kicked this all off is she heard me say, there's so much academic research about psychological safety, but there's very little practical information for leaders who want to know, how do I increase psychological safety? What can I do practically day to day? So Karolin reached out to me with an email, and I have the email. I'll save it forever. It was like June 1st, 2021. And the subject line was crazy idea. Right. And in the email, she said, Minette, I heard you on this podcast. We really see things a lot the same way. What would you think? What if we wrote a pamphlet or a brochure about the how of psychological safety? And that's how it came to be. And what was so interesting is that we got on a Zoom call. She set up an online whiteboard that we use to this day for brainstorming and keeping track of ideas and what we're going to do. And over time, we really, really practice everything that we put in the book in terms of how do we create a space where we can do our best work together, we can innovate, we can brainstorm, we can have these crazy ideas, not all of which will make it into a book, but are worth exploring. And there was always this sense of experimentation. Not everything's going to be perfect. We're going to fail here and there. And let's just be open to all these ideas. And I think what's so cool, we're going to meet this year in person, finally. We still haven't met in person. All of this virtually. And yet we managed to establish just so much trust, just so much openness and human connection. And I think it's a great story of what is possible in the virtual world.
Yeah, the concept of it starting with an crazy idea, and now you're holding a book in your hands. And that was just in 2021. So that it happened fairly quickly. That's fantastic.
It did. And by design, the book is short. We wanted it to be as short as possible because I have a lot of business books on my shelf that I've read maybe 50 pages of and stopped because it's first of all, time is of the essence, but also things get really redundant and like, I don't need all this information. And we decided we wanted to write the most practical short book we could. And so it came together fairly quickly.
And you've actually called it a playbook. So the psychological safety playbook. So it that speaks that you wanted it to be practical. What were your hopes with taking this approach?
Well, we were really deliberate. There are a lot of books that are called playbooks that just kind of use that as a buzzword, but they really aren't, a how-to. And we wanted it to be very practical. We wanted it to be everything in there is actionable, and also it's all modular. So the idea of plays is like you can pick any play and they stand alone, right? If you're talking about like a sports playbook, let's try play 15 today or whatever. So we decided when we structured this book that it was going to have 5 major chapters, which we call plays. And then within each of those, there are 5 moves that are related to the bigger play. So there are basically 25 individual topics in there. And they are very practical actions that you as a leader can take every day. And the idea is that our hope was that this is a book you keep at your desk. It's a book you have on your shelf and that you refer to regularly. And like maybe today, you're going to have a challenging meeting. And so, I want to go look at how can I listen more without getting defensive, because I know this is going to be a rough situation here. So let me prepare myself for that. And we just want this to be something that leaders and their teams use day in and day out to really change how leadership looks and how workplaces behave and feel to everyone there.
Yeah, no, fantastic. So you want it to be a book that people continue to go back to, that it's not a once read, it's there as a resource. And, I think in reading it, it felt very much like that. And you pointed out directly that, this is meant to jump between chapters, which gave me some freedom to kind of skim around in it as well. So when the term psychological safety, it's becoming common, it's being used, it's, being used in many different ways. People have probably bumped into it in some form. How do you define it? How do you and Karolin define it?
Yeah, and we borrow certainly from, someone wonderful like Amy Edmondson, who's been researching the topic. But the way we talk about it is that rather than being sort of an academic concept or a geeky term, it's actually a deeply human feeling and experience. And it's this belief that when you're in a group, because it really is a group phenomenon, when you're in a group, in this group, you feel that you can ask a question, you can be yourself, you can take a risk, you can make a mistake, you can even challenge the status quo without fear that you're going to be excluded, marginalized, embarrassed, or just seen as, that person over there that we don't really want to include in this group.
Right. Yeah. And when you do you find that psychological safety is something that some value more than others? Do you find it's equal across the board? Do people only notice its absence, or what do you find on that front?
I think that if we're honest with ourselves, every single human being, whether they know the term or not, values the feeling of being heard and seen and, valued for who they are. We actually need that as a species. That's how we've evolved, right? We need to be part of communities and groups. However, when I think about if you went out to, 1,000 leaders and you said, do you think psychological safety is important, defining the term? Some of them would say no. And, I'm thinking about some very visible leaders in the workplace. Say, I'm like taking Elon Musk. He doesn't care about psychological safety. For him, that would probably be ridiculous. He just wants hardcore people, right? That's what he says. So there are definitely these models of leadership, and there are leaders out there who think that it's coddling people, it's being soft, that we don't want to even encourage that. But I think I hope they are the exception. I would think most leaders want to bring out the best in their workforce. They want people to be able to do the best work they possibly can. And there's lots of evidence that when people do feel psychologically safe, they perform better. They share their innovative ideas. They're more creative versus when they hold back and when they don't feel safe, And I've certainly been in those shoes at times where I'm like, I'm not going to speak up. It's way too risky. So I may have a really great idea, but I'm not going to put it out there because it doesn't feel safe to do so. So I think all leaders who want to have high-performing, engaged, motivated, and innovative teams should value psychological safety. But I think there's some misconceptions about it. And maybe that's why there's some leaders who say, oh, no, that means that, we can never disagree, or we have to be forced polite with one another. And that's actually not what psychological safety is about.
So when you see leaders resisting, we talked about some famous leaders resisting because it feels maybe more like coddling. And the other is we can't disagree. Any other reasons why you think people might resist pushing to make their workplace more safe psychologically?
Well, I think maybe it's also just a slight misconception or misunderstanding is that if we have, this is the idea that if we have a psychologically safe environment, we can never do layoffs. We can never do performance management. We can't hold people to high standards. And that's actually just not true. It's when I think people don't fully understand it is that if we have a safe environment, we can hold people to accountability. And of course, it's not a situation where nothing bad ever happens, right? I mean, we all operate in the world in which economics play a part, and there are things that are going to happen. But what psychological safety gives you is this ability to actually talk about things openly instead of putting them in the dark and hiding them and having them taboo to talk about. And, that open disagreement or open debate that fuels innovation and fuels new ideas. But people are afraid of that. And they're often afraid of I don't know how to control that if it happens. I don't know how to set the parameters around having a healthy debate where people are not attacked. But, so I think a lot of leaders, and honestly, I don't blame any leaders. Few people are trained in how to do this well. I certainly wasn't when I was leading very large teams. I had to learn by mistakes and watch people who did it well and watch people who did it badly and emulate the behavior I saw that I admired and not emulate the behavior that was, less than healthy, I thought. And so we just aren't trained in how do you do this work. And so that's really the impetus for writing a book like this is we want to give you the how-tos.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I would imagine that you've, given the field that you're in and the commitment that you've made to it, that you hear, some misconceptions in and around psychological safety. Which ones rise to the surface for you that are commonly thrown around about what psychological safety is or isn't?
So I think the number one is that it just means being really politically correct and nice. Right. Which is not at all the case. It really means we can actually call each other out if we're not doing what we said we're going to do, or if we just don't see eye to eye. That's part of it. So it's not about this forced politeness at all. In fact, I've been in those environments where everyone's really polite to one another, and they then they'll be nice in the meeting. They walk out of the meeting, and then they say, "Can you believe what Peter just said? This was ridiculous." That and I may have seemed like I was super nice to you in the meeting, but I actually didn't agree with you. That is not what psychological safety is about. So it's that feeling of it means that we're going to be in this politically correct, can never have controversy environment. So that's I think the top one. And then the other one is that it is just an excuse. We can use it as an excuse not to get our work done, not to meet our deadlines, not to have high quality, and none of that is true either.
What have you heard in and around correlations between psychological safety and productivity and beliefs around that? Are people do people believe that you can't have one and the other, or what are you hearing on that?
I haven't heard so much about productivity, although I think people fear one of the fears may be related to that is that people fear, everything's going to take too long if we have to hear everyone's perspectives, right? We'll never be able to make a decision. It doesn't mean that you can't put time boxes around things and you can't say, look, we're under pressure. We're going to do, be really efficient about how we hear diverse perspectives. We're going to invite dissent and things like that. So I think the fear about the productivity isn't that people won't get their work done. It's the fear maybe of slowing down the decision-making process or ideation process because we want to really be inclusive and hear all the voices. I think they're very efficient ways to do that.
So the concept of generally people might believe that psychological safety means slowing down. Could you foresee anything in which it might actually speed things up?
Yes. Yes, and I'm glad you asked that question, because I think here's what can happen is that in an unpsychologically safe environment, people will not speak up about problems that they foresee, for example.
Right.
And you hear about these disasters that have happened where it wasn't safe to disagree. The prevailing conformity bias was very strong. So you agree with everyone that this product is ready to launch. Spaceship Challenger is one of those horrible examples in history. But I mean, I've actually seen it in the software world.
Right.
I remember a product release that wasn't ready to go out, but there was a lot of internal pressure to put it out. And what happens? You put out a terrible release, and then you lose tons of time and reputation damage because you've got to deal with your customers who are unhappy, and you need to go back and rework all of that. It would have been faster to actually slow down that release to fix the known defects that were there and get it out a strong release on time instead of having to spend all that time after. So yes, I think that, the question of could it speed things up? Absolutely. And I think we have to be very smart about, for example, how do we run meetings where we want to brainstorm or where we want to invite meetings, lots of viewpoints and lots of ideas, and then converge on what we're going to do. And I actually really, really like a lot of the design thinking techniques because I think they are very efficient at crowdsourcing like huge amounts of ideas, huge numbers of ideas, and then digesting them and synthesizing them and coming to a really good answer in a pretty short period of time.
Yeah, no, that's I can see how it long-term speed things up for sure. Yeah. I'm interested to, I hope we get to a point where we don't have to talk about the pandemic for much longer, but let's just go there for a minute. So in what ways has the pandemic changed the psychological safety landscape? And, what can workplaces do to manage working remotely more effectively from your perspective?
Yeah, the pandemic, I don't know if we'll ever stop talking about it. It's a good point. I think in some ways it has actually shown a light on things that we didn't talk about before, right? I mean, the fact that we all had to suddenly be home and people started having to, there wasn't that very clear divider between our professional life and our workplace. In our home life, right? So there's your kids in the background or your spouse in the background or just the wall of your office or your bedroom or wherever you're having your meeting, right? And so people are starting to see more about who the human is that you're dealing with. And I think the other thing is we were all dealing with so much uncertainty and fear and, illness, and then parents having to have kids homeschooled at the same time they were working. Right. So everything came together in this unbelievable way that we were not prepared for. And I think that the good that comes out of it, and I actually see lots of benefits. One is that I think we can create, in many ways, safer, more inclusive spaces when people do have this flexibility to be in their home, to be wherever they want to be in the world, because you're basically honoring who they are as a human and what the constraints they have on their life are, but they can still do their work. And, a lot of even the online tools that we have are actually better than the in-person experience. I mean, think about like Zoom, right? Mm-hmm. I'm just taking that as an example. There are obviously other tools, but by default, you turn on closed captioning. People have a new tool in front of them that they don't have in a room, right? That can be really helpful, not just for deaf people, but for people who process information differently, for people for whom English is a second language. Having those captions is hugely beneficial. So I actually think we have the ability to create more psychologically safe environments in a virtual environment. And of course now we have to talk about hybrid, because now some people are in the office and some people are at home. And how do you make that really inclusive and equitable for everybody? And I think we have to be so mindful of, if some people are back in the office and some people are still working virtually, how do we not have those conversations where it becomes us and them, that the people in the room are having a better experience, a more favorable experience than those who are remote and are zooming in for it. So what I think the pandemic gave us is it gave us a set of tools that we can use intelligently to create a better environment for everyone. And, for example, if someone doesn't feel safe sometimes in a big meeting, it can be really uncomfortable to unmute, raise your hand, unmute yourself, and try to interject, because even the voice thing is hard to interject when someone else is speaking. But we have those symbols. We have a hand raise functionality. We have chat. And chat is actually a really interesting thing. If you've ever observed in a big meeting, you'll usually have a big virtual meeting. You usually have a couple of people who speak up. That's true in the physical world too. And then you have everyone else who's silent.
Right.
But you have chat functionality. Suddenly people you've never heard from are typing in the chat.
Yeah,
and they are willing to have their voices heard in a different way. So I actually think we can leverage this kind of new world that we're operating in to create a safer, more inclusive environment for everybody, no matter where they are, no matter how they process information. And but we do need to, and especially leaders, need to be very deliberate in creating those environments.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. And so many insights. And I do believe the pandemic was an expediter of many things for people. So that's good to hear your vantage point on that. Now, what I thought we could do is unpack a few quotes from your book, some ones that stood out to me as I was going through it. So leaders tend to believe that they need to have all the answers and they cannot show emotion. It's time to set aside those limiting beliefs. Courageous communication requires leaders to be vulnerable, to show up authentically, and to acknowledge that we are all works in progress. What does that quote mean to you, and how would you unpack it?
Yeah, it's something I believe in deeply, as does Karolin. I mean, and we start off fairly early in the book talking about that we believe that traditional models of leadership that certainly we grew up with were that the leader is sort of this infallible, all-powerful being, and that as a leader, you don't say, I don't know. You don't ask for help. You don't admit that you're having an emotional reaction to something, right? You have to have this facade that's sort of like, I am perfect. I don't have any chinks in my armor. And instead, what everyone wants is to be able to identify with leaders as fellow human beings. And, that the whole subtitle of our book, Lead More Powerfully by Being More Human, we fundamentally believe that being human, and that means showing your vulnerability, showing that you are fallible, showing that you don't have all the answers and that you're open to other points of view, that makes you stronger. That will only make you stronger. And we just want leaders to start to understand that it's the imperfections that are going to be your strength. It's asking for help that's going to be a strength. It's saying, I don't know. Does someone else have the answer? That is going to make you a powerful leader. And you're going to be the leader then that people want to work with and for. And so it's sort of turning traditional leadership on its head. And, I led teams for 20 years in the software industry. And I started out leading a team of writers, and I ended up leading engineering for a 10,000 person company. And I will tell you that I never had all the answers. I was never even a software developer, and I was leading software engineers. And the reason I could be successful in those roles is because I stood up as myself and like, I don't know how to do this. Who's going to help me do this? Who's on board with it? And, I definitely had a lot of success, I think, because I didn't show up as like, I know everything. I never knew anything. I never knew everything. Right. I knew some things and I could learn others. And that's what I think makes someone a strong leader.
Yeah. Yeah. No. We do a fair amount of work in and around coaching. And when we're working with a team and we do a coaching demo, we'll quite often try to get the leader of that team to be the one that goes up first, and that just opens up the door for everybody to kind of step in and show up like themselves. On the concept of listening, I was doing some reading yesterday talking about how there's zero formal education dedicated to listening, lots on writing and whatnot. But listening is an art and probably the most underdeveloped leadership skill. We will rarely listen as much as we think we are.
Yes. Yes. And that's the second play in our book, because first of all, we, as you said, there's no training in listening because we all think we know how to listen. Yeah. We think it's sort of this innate skill. Right. And honestly, there's several, I'll unpack that for you in a few ways. One is that we are often distracted when we think we're listening. And that's just basic. I mean, we've got our phones, we've got our browsers, we've got a million things going on. So the first thing is that we just have to commit to focus. And Karolin uses the term monotask, as opposed to multitask. You have to commit to monotasking if you're in conversation, if you're in a meeting. So it's the focus. But there are other things that really keep us from listening besides just the distractions. And one of them is, and it kind of goes back to that first point, the first quote that you pulled out about being, sort of perfect and not being self-aware, is that we are listening. Like I listen to your question, and rather than listen to the question, what am I doing? I'm actually just preparing my response. And the minute we start to prepare what we're going to say next, we stop listening. So one of the practices is really to just stay present, listen to every word, ask clarifying questions to make sure that we understand before we even consider responding. And that's a big piece. But there's so much that goes into listening, because we think also that there's a little bit of this fear of like, if I really listen to you, you're going to convince me of something I don't want to be convinced of. And, I think that also
I might have to shift.
I might have to shift my thinking. And again, like, that's a leadership superpower. Can you shift your thinking? You don't have to be right all the time. And maybe if you really listen to someone, you can start to understand things differently. So there's so much to listening. And then of course, and I kind of alluded to it, is that one of the things that really keeps us from listening is that we get defensive. We get challenged. Someone asks us a hard question. Someone says, you didn't think of the most important thing. And suddenly then we're in fight, flight, freeze mode, right? And our brains have taken over in trying to keep us safe, just as if it's physical danger and social danger are one and the same to our brains. So we can't listen. We can't be rational. We can't have thoughtful dialogue when we're feeling defensive. So that's a huge thing. And honestly, I experienced that so many times in my own work life. And it was, I would say, fairly late in my career that I even learned about listening without getting defensive, and what happens if you can just pause before you let that automatic defensive reaction dictate your behavior, but instead to pause, take a breath, and say, wait, I want to make sure I understand you, or ask a clarifying question or something to just calm you down, instead of having that knee-jerk reaction that usually is not going to go well.
Yes.
I've regretted a lot of times I didn't take that pause.
Yeah, I've the concept of listening to respond versus listening to understand, and really entering in and listening into rather than listening at. It's such an art form, so much to be learned. It's like even tough in an interview situation like this, because you're moving through a conversation and you want to be present, and you also want to keep it going. So I appreciate that. That was a nice learning. Other discussion in the book was in and around the connection between emotions and decision making. And traditionally, we try to kind of separate them, say they can't coexist, but there's power in them coexisting. And I'd like to hear what you have to say about that.
Yeah, so this is actually something I learned from Karolin, which is that our brains actually, when we don't have access to our emotions, we can't make decisions. Right. It's just connected in the brain. And so it doesn't mean, and I want to, maybe someone's going to misunderstand this all and think that it means that you make only emotional decisions and disregard data or facts. And no, not at all. But actually the powerful combination of using facts and using data, but not ignoring our emotions and not trying to say emotions play no role in this, but how can they work together? And, we really talk about the fact that no human, whether you're a leader or anyone else, can turn off their emotions, right? Unless you've had some kind of a brain injury, you can't turn off emotion. And so what we really believe is that it's much better to be aware of your emotions, because if you are not aware of what you're experiencing, what happens is that those emotions kind of take over, right? I'm angry right now. I'm defensive. I'm scared. And you will operate from a point of fear or anger, and you won't actually be able to have the response that you want. So we have these reactions. If we can say like, okay, Minette, I'm noticing right now that you're getting pretty angry. Take a breath, recognize that. You don't have to respond in anger. You can respond with a question to try to understand why this person is saying the thing that's making you angry.
Right.
So that awareness, and a lot of this goes back to the work of Susan David and emotional agility when we reference her book, because what she says, and I think is really true, is that the mere act of labeling the emotions that we're experiencing helps us not react to them in the same way. It's like, I'm angry, I'm sad, I'm whatever. And there's like so many long lists of emotions that we often don't have the vocabulary to describe. But just knowing what's happening, then we can become aware of them and change our behavior. So I think that whole decision making is like, I may make a knee-jerk decision if I let my emotions rule me, but instead I could say like, I'm really fearful right now. Now, let's see how I can sort of minimize the fear and make an intelligent decision here. And, maybe you need more data. Maybe you need someone else's perspective to help you get through the fear. But I think it's really important to not pretend we don't have these emotions and ignore them, because they can be like, especially if you're really scared of making this decision, there's probably a reason for that. Maybe there's a huge risk there. So let's see, what can we do to minimize those risks?
Is this a risk worth taking?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
So we're nearing our end of our time together, and I want to acknowledge the fact that you've built this beautiful career and you've dedicated this chapter of it to belonging and inclusion. It's something it's clear it's very much on your radar. So if you were to speak directly from your heart into the heart of other leaders, what would you say on this topic to them?
Yeah, it's deeply in my heart. And part of what led me to this path is spending 30 years in the corporate world.
Right.
And, being both a manager of people and managed by other people, and seeing how few leaders really do know how to lead inclusively with empathy and to create a safe environment for everybody to do their best work. And what I want to say to every leader out there is that it's in your power. It's like these small actions that you do consistently day in and day out can make a huge difference. And the other thing I'll say is that people are suffering out there in the workplace, and they're often suffering needlessly because they're not being appreciated. They're not being allowed to speak, and they're not being able to do their most creative and best work. And you as a leader can change that. And so what I'll say to every leader and every manager I work with is, don't get overwhelmed by this topic, whether it's inclusion or psychological safety. Just start by taking some small actions and putting them into practice and iterating. And that's why we have this book for you, this playbook that you can really take out and experiment with. And I recommend trying something new immediately.
Wow. Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you. And thank you for writing this book. I'm glad for that magic moment that pulled you and Karolin together, and for that crazy idea that turned into a book that will hopefully inform and advise leaders as they aim to tackle this important subject. Now, you did talk about another book.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, what is that one about, and what are your big hopes with that topic?
So the other book is called The Boldly Inclusive Leader. And I started it actually like in 2019, and it just was a longer, slower journey. And so it's a longer book, and it comes out in August. And that book is I would say, just a more comprehensive book. Psychological safety is a chapter in that book.
Right.
And the book, The Boldly Inclusive Leader, is really, what does it mean to lead inclusively and to, make it so that everyone, and I'm talking about every aspect of diversity, so not singling in on anyone, everyone can really thrive in the workplace, and how you as a manager at any level can really create that culture and that environment for everyone to thrive.
Has there been any big surprises as you pulled that one together?
Oh, well, so many. First of all, writing like a 55,000 word book, which is, like 4 times the length of the playbook, is a long process. And what I found is that, there's a lot of information out there. But what people told me, what my publisher told me, what my editors told me is that, how to differentiate this book from all the other books out there is that it's only the stories that you can tell. It's the story that you have lived in your career. So I think the most surprising thing to me is how much people were interested in the actual stories of being inside the software industry and what it was really like. And I include those, not only my own story, but other people's stories in that book, because I think that's what resonates with people. It's not the data and the facts, although those are in there too. It's really the lived experiences, and that's what people resonate with.
Yeah, that sounds good. Can't wait to catch that one. I want to say thank you. Thank you so much for investing time here today, for sharing your story of putting the book together, of the key elements of the book. Thank you for the gift that you've given to leaders in upping their psychological safety quotient. And it's been a pleasure speaking with you today.
Thank you so much for having me. Really enjoyed it, Peter.